It's another Israeli Apartheid Week that South Africa has celebrated. And it is celebration because it has embraced thousands of young people around the country, thousands of people in different communities. It's a time when Afro-Palestine issues are very much in the news. And it is a very important moment to take into account BDS's point of view, and also the privilege of having Kumi Naidoo here, who has been part of an Afro struggle movement for the past 30 years, really, your whole life, Kumi. And so as we celebrate Israeli Apartheid Week, I'd like to welcome Kwara Kekana from BDS and Comrade Kumi.
Thank you.
I think in terms of how you view yourself, Comrade Kumi, in August you're going to be moving into a very, very important global role at Amnesty International. And you've just stepped out of another important global role at Greenpeace, but you're always involved in community organizations and so on. But how do we come to terms with the fact that, you know, BDS, Israeli Apartheid Week, exist, and there's an assumption that we all share a common view as Africans supporting the Palestinians?
I see within young people on this continent a desire to work for a much better, more just, more equitable, more peaceful continent, but they are very, very committed to help brothers and sisters whether it's in as far away as the Rohingya in Rakhine State in Burma, or whether it's the Palestinians, or whether it's what's happening in Syria and so on. So I don't want to be negative. I feel positive about what I'm seeing young people doing, and BDS is a very good impression of it. I would like to just say one thing about BDS and what it means and how governments have responded. You see, in terms of international law, people who are occupied and colonized and so on have a right to self-defense, and they have a right to self-determination. But the Palestinian people have been told, when they engage in anything that crosses the line, that you cannot do that, it's wrong by the international community, by Israel and so on, because it's not peaceful and so on, right? Now, we all want peace, but you have to have a just peace, right? And so the very strong negative response to BDS must be questioned, not only on the part of the Israeli state, but also on the allies of Israel. Because what is boycott, divestment and sanctions movement anywhere in the world? It's a coming together of citizens to use a historically tested peaceful tool of resistance, right? So whether one formally signs up to it or not, this is a peaceful act of citizens using the purchasing power to make a point, to get a government that is rogue to act in a more responsible way and in a more human rights respectful way. So I think it's important to just note that contradiction, because it's like saying to the Palestinian people, international law recognizes that you're occupied, your kids are getting killed, you don't have decent access to water and so on. You can't resist through, armed struggle, fair enough. But now you can't even resist through getting people to engage in a peaceful act of civil disobedience. So you're saying to Palestinians, we as the Israeli state will not tolerate any resistance. And I think it's important to note one thing I think is positive, is that if you look at the United States and if you look at the BDS movement there, you are seeing actually a very strong participation of American Jewish young people in that movement, and we welcome, embrace that, and we acknowledge their courage of doing that. And even in Israel as well. I mean, some of the people that have educated me recently about some of the intricacies of how the Israeli state operates, which, by the way, sounds very similar to how the apartheid state operated. And some of the people who have been the best informants have been Israelis, citizens who refused to go to the army, right? And how they were punished, how they were treated in prison and so on.
with the backdrop of Israel deporting refugees and engaging in what we would regard as nefarious activities with 2-3 different African countries around how to deport those refugees, this is what Israeli Apartheid Week was centered on.
We should be very clear, and as Africans rising for justice, peace and dignity, we remind the Israeli government that they are signatories to a range of refugee protocols, that they are in violation of those commitments when they actually choose to deport people to third-party countries like Rwanda and Uganda. And by the way, the people who are migrating or trying to leave, they're not from, they're more from Eritrea, Sudan, and Ethiopia, and so on. And this is not surprising, though. It's sad, it's wrong, it's unjust, and it is a pattern of Israeli government behavior which is violating their obligations in terms of international law. But I'll just end by saying, the sad reality is, let's be blunt about it, there is a hierarchy within Israel. You've got the Israeli Jews, you've got the Ethiopian Jews, and then you've got the Palestinians, right? And so the migration now of Africans, and Ethiopian Jews, they are Israeli citizens, but they face multiple, discrimination and so on. So we hope that sanity will prevail and that Africans will be treated fairly in terms of international law, but I think we would be very naive, given the track record of the Israeli state, to believe that they could act with the level of magnanimity, humanity, and compliance to international law. We would be naive to expect it, given their track record. But we still should insist that they do it, and we should continue to fight and put pressure on Israel and its allies to fulfill their obligations, multiple levels, but specifically also on this question of African refugees.
It most certainly is naked racism, like we know and understand from our own apartheid past. And this is, BDS has propelled this argument around Israeli apartheid for its entire existence, particularly in this country, but that has escalated over the past 2 to 3 years, to the extent now that Israeli Apartheid Week is something that South Africans know, they understand its symbolism and so on. Is that right, Kwara? I mean, it's become almost your primary agenda.
Absolutely. Firstly, thank you, Janet. I think the one thing is that, Israeli Apartheid Week as a campaign that was raising awareness or seeks to raise awareness of Israel's apartheid policies actually came before the BDS call was issued. So a year after, kind of, at university campuses, you had young people on campuses, beginning to have this conversation and raising awareness of Israel's treatment towards Palestinians, indigenous Palestinians. The following year, then the BDS call was issued by, the majority of Palestinian civil society organizations saying, we need your help to the international community. And that's through a campaign of boycotts, divestment, and sanctions. And in the 14th year, and you kind of had this pronounced, the level at which, and we were having this conversation earlier, that, in the 14th year of Israeli Apartheid Week in South Africa, perhaps it's most pronounced kind of in terms of activities, the heightened activities, the number of activities as well, but also the diverse kind of activities that we have, from cultural events, sporting activities, and of course the traditional kind of activities that you have at university campuses, your seminars, the political dialogues, those kind of conversations. But it's really managed to penetrate into communities. And the conscientization that this campaign is able to bring, the raising awareness and educating people on the ground, and of course drawing the parallels that you're talking about, the similarities between our own struggle against apartheid and what the Palestinians are facing today, that message comes out through IW.
When you were speaking about Rwanda and Uganda earlier on, and Kwara's references now, I'm also reminded of a rally that was held this past week in which Kwara's colleague, Mohammed Desai, was, really trying to draw attention to the people who were at the rally's memory around the frontline states, around Southern Africa, around Central Africa, around North Africa, and how, the risks those countries took in supporting the ANC and the liberation movements. Absolutely. Really risks.
It is terrible. I mean, imagine, okay, so with the Eritrean refugees in Israel at the moment. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know the level of repression that exists in Eritrea in terms of political space and so on. So it's not surprising that people who resist and try to push for democracy end up outside of the country. So to now just say you're going to take those people and dump them in a refugee camp in Rwanda and Uganda where they don't speak the local language and so on, I would say it's irresponsible for the Ugandan and Rwandan governments to have entered those deals.
What goes into planning Israeli Apartheid Week is just sheer madness, but it's absolutely fun. But the kind of commitment that you see from, and Kumi keeps on saying, the involvement of young people, And I mean, working from the BDS South Africa offices in Johannesburg, you have people coming in left, right, and center, every single day saying, I'm available for 2 hours. What can I do? Are there flyers I can hand out? What can I do? What events are happening on this particular campus, on that particular campus? And, the nice thing is when people see activities happening, they're like, oh my God, we're feeling left out. Kwara, what are you doing next week? I'm like, I'm just not just sitting around and doing stuff. Things are happening. But it's absolutely fantastic. And yes, you do get, allies in places you never thought you'd get, get allies. But what's amazing really is the response from communities. And the beauty about Israeli Apartheid Week is that it's about self-organized events. And the encouragement is always, you don't need to go out of the way in which you organize yourselves. And we say, if you're doing a stock fill, for example, that discusses community-based issues, how you organize your money within the community, take a moment within your weekly meetings to raise the issue of Israel-Palestine. Be it, if you're a hiker, there's a group of you that hikes, go on a hike on a Sunday. We did a hike this past Sunday, and we took a moment just before the hike to reflect on the issue. So it's about getting people in different spaces, to say what is the impact of the Israeli-Palestine, even within the context of your own, how you organize within sports, within the context of environment. We've also had these kind of weekly sessions that were built up to Israeli Apartheid Week, and we had fantastic kind of conversations on different issues. The one was about architecture and oppression, which was quite interesting. So it's quite important as well to reflect on the different elements within the occupation itself, how the environment is affected, how the construction of the wall, the architecture of it all as well, ultimately is part of the, the bigger part of the occupation as well, but also many other different elements as well. But of course, in South Africa as well, as you say, there are hostile kind of, or antagonistic kind of elements on certain campuses. At the University of Cape Town as well, for the last 2-3 years, you've had the South African Union of Jewish Students, actively trying to counter BDS initiatives and Israeli Apartheid Week activities at Wits University as well. But the activists there, it's pound for pound. People are really on the ground and doing the work. And it's really about convincing 5 students that this is the situation. We challenge people, come to our events and hear the narrative. And that's what Israeli Apartheid Week essentially is about, raising awareness and educating people. Of course, the Zionists and the pro-Israelis do their bit as well, to put their narrative across as well. But I think over the years, the Hearts and Minds campaign really is, it's winning. Yeah, it's amazing. Israeli Apartheid Week is amazing, especially the kind of events that are happening on campuses. You have the South African Jews for a Free Palestine as well, that are also saying that the South African Zionist Federation, for example, and South African Jewish Board of Deputies, it's not the sole voice of the Jewish community in this country, and they don't speak for all of us. And we as a progressive Jewish voice in this country also are in support of the BDS movement as a tactic that can be applied to put pressure on Israel, but also to say that what Israel is doing must never do it in our name as progressive Jews. So that there's that voice as well, and it's also beginning to emerge on campuses. When you have Saudis doing whatever they're doing, and that voice is there as well, that is not a representation of what some of us as Jewish people, are saying, what our position on the issue is. So those allies are there and they do exist.
Yes. In 1959, 1960, when the anti-apartheid movement, there was a nascent boycott movement, and then in the early 60s after Sharpeville, the anti-apartheid movement started. It took a lot of courage, I suppose, at that time in the world for the young people involved to begin to allow momentum to grow, step out there. But it did take 2 decades, when you think about it, from 1960 to 1980, early 1980s, to achieve critical mass around the boycott movement. And a lot of that was driven by young people doing the kind of thing you're describing, handing out flyers, putting information on tubes, etc. Are you prepared for that? Do you think Israeli apartheid, the divestment sanctions campaign against Israeli apartheid could take that long? How do you steel yourselves and prepare yourselves for what could now be a fairly intense, arduous and reasonably lengthy battle?
Well, I think the first is that we certainly hope not. That it doesn't take that long. But I think what has been kind of what we've been fortunate is, and I'm maybe speaking for activists that are part of the global BDS movement, is that the BDS movement itself is inspired by the isolation campaigns that started in the late 50s, early 60s. And, you know, the tactics and the strategies we learned from the anti-apartheid movement comrades. And even those that were part of the A&M, you know, are part of the BDS movement today. So BDS is quite fortunate because it can apply the similar tactics, and when we talk about innovation and creativity, and you know, you kind of you have to be different. So beyond adding the kind of, you know, onto an existing kind of model of an isolation campaign and what would work, there are BDS is really quite similar to the anti-apartheid movement. Of course, there's significant, you know, differences, especially around, for example, the academic boycott, where during the struggle against apartheid, the academic boycott focused on individuals. Oh, you're South African, then you're subject to the boycott. In the case of the BDS movement today, that is not the case. You know, the idea is to focus on institutional boycotts, institutions, academic students that are complicit, and that really provide the ideological and kind of, you know, support of the regime. For settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation. So it's in that breath. But really, you know, Comrade Janet, it's scary when you say, are we prepared, you know, to go beyond? I think that the BDS movement has managed to register significant victories in a short space of time than what the anti-apartheid movement managed to do that took about 2 decades. And it's precisely because we are learning from the anti-apartheid movement. We, you know, the kind of material that's there, you know, from the archives. We talked about archiving earlier on, you know, the kind of documents that are there, the posters from the day, back in the days, the T-shirts, the creativity that people back in the day, it could be, don't expose your age, but that you used back in your day, and the way of organizing, how to speak to a particular crowd, students, communities, those in the creatives industry, and asking them to back the cultural boycott, you know. Those tactics still work. We're talking about comedy shows that we're doing as part of Israeli Apartheid Week, and saying, as a comedian, as those within the creative industry, you have a particular voice, you know, appeal to a particular group of people, and use what you have, you know, that constituency that you bring along, you know, to say, the creative industry is important, and as a comedian, as a singer, whatever, you know, it's quite important that we also use our art, you know, for social justice issues and talk about those issues. So we are doing that. So BDS is achieving in a short space of time compared to what the anti-apartheid movement. So hopefully, Comrade Janet, the situation ends soon, and we're not engaged in this conversation again.
And we know that BDS works very hard on a party political level. You really do, and congratulations for that. But you know, how do you make that happen? How do you lobby a government sufficiently to get it to change its policy on a diplomatic scale?
I think the one thing, and you know, making reference to the African National Congress resolution in particular, the one that came from the last elective conference that talks about the downgrading of the South African embassy in Israel. But the beauty of that resolution, I think, but also is that, you know, we working with other, you know, branches and structures of the ANCs, that and this is a conversation that started from the policy conference, where branches of the ANC themselves were kind of leading the charge where this particular resolution was concerned. And what was also important is that at the elective conference itself, the Palestine Liberation Organization representative that was there put it to the ANC that, and you know, there's this conversation, Comrade Janet, that South Africa needs to play a mediatory role, and in terms of the dialogue and the conversation. And the Palestinians are saying that is not what we're asking of you, and you need to listen to our request. And this was what was put forward in the conference, that we're asking for a downgrade of the South African embassy in Israel. That is what we're putting across to you as the Palestine Liberation Organization, as your friend, as your sister party, or political party organization. And that's what's important. So it's very important as well that branches and structures of the ANC as well put pressure on their own organization, and to ensure that not just this particular resolution as well. I think a lot of things came out from the elective conference, the land question as well, and the question of free education as well, of course, before the former President Zuma announced. But those kind of things, you know, those resolutions need to be translated into government policy. And it is the responsibility, of course, civil society organizations putting pressure on the ruling party, but the ANC structures and members themselves putting pressure on the ruling party to make sure that their policies are translated into government policy. And I mean, you know, the South African government really, there's a responsibility on government, and we're lagging behind in certain areas. For example, the EU has a number of countries that has issued warnings in terms of where settlements are concerned. So even questions around settlements, you know, it's a position that the South African government can and should be taking. But ultimately, it's the responsibility of civil society to put pressure on government. But it's important that structures, members of the ANC themselves, call on their own organization to ensure that their own resolutions are translated into government policy.
The bottom line is, history is on the side of the Palestinian people and the justness of their struggle. If you are a person of faith, irrespective of which faith you're talking about, I'm just coming from a South African Council of Churches event in Cape Town where it was about sort of ecological justice and political justice and economic justice. But it's interesting, at least 3 times the Palestinian issue came up, you know, because you can see the intersectionality of different issues. And you know, one of the things that we forget about the Israeli-Palestinian issue is how environmental issues are so central to it. I mean, if you look at water and the politics of water, right, it is central to that conflict. But, you know, we don't necessarily have that acknowledged by the Israeli state and so on, you know. So I'll just end, you know, my best friend, Kumi Naidoo, who was murdered by the apartheid regime. In our last conversation, he taught me something very powerful. He said, you know, we must realize that the struggle for justice is a marathon and not a sprint. And the biggest sacrifice and contribution we can make is about having courage, perseverance, and stamina to continue to push, to fight, to struggle until the injustice or challenge has been eradicated. And I think what will make a considerable difference is if we also embrace in all our struggles, including for the Palestinian solidarity struggle, a more intensive use of peaceful civil disobedience. If history teaches us one thing, when humanity has faced a major injustice or a major challenge, those injustices and challenges only started to begin to disappear when decent people stood up and said, enough is enough and no more. I'm prepared to go to prison if necessary. I'm prepared to give my life if necessary. And Comrade Kora, if you're in prison, I'll bring food for you, don't worry. So, you know, because, you know, when that happens, people say, why does this intelligent young woman put her life at risk and risk that? Because that starts asking, because, you know, when people sacrifice, put their lives on the line, it creates a moral environment, a sort of where people begin to ask deep moral questions. So if we are going to have the kinds of lobbying impact that we have, even with our own government, you know, peaceful civil disobedience, whether it is peaceful demonstrations around Israeli embassies with our messages where people are willing to court arrest. You know, in the US, outside the South African embassy, one of the most powerful things happened where celebrities, singers, sports people, every day they were going and getting arrested outside the apartheid South African embassy. That was a communication campaign. That was an awareness campaign. Every arrest was a story. So, if you are doing this, will volunteer to come and get arrested. Try and make it before August if possible.
You spoke about decent people. It's been a privilege to speak to 2 highly decent people, and very warm congratulations on another successful IAW, and much love, best wishes for August.
Thank
you very much.
Thanks, Jan.
Thank you, Jan.